To YRC or not to YRC? That should be a question that runs through your mind, but if you're anything like me, it probably doesn't. In fact, not a lot's been running through there for a while, but that's besides the point. Over the years of playing Xrd, the one thing that's been consistent in the discussion is that people are frustrated by YRC, but not in the ways that people normally love to complain. If you think about complaints about wave dashing, for example, it typically comes from people starting at the door of competitive Melee, complaining about how it feels weird. Once you get just a little bit on that learning curve though, how it feels to input a wave dash disappears from the conversation pretty quickly. A lot of complaints about fighting game systems come from the entry level because if you decided to ride out the rest of the learning journey to whatever stop you decided to get off at, chances are you're enjoying the game enough to accept it for what it is. Sometimes as you get to the top of the skill level, they come back up, but like, I don't know, man, peep the Super 3. Yellow Roman Cancel, however, is a system that I've seen brought up from the entry level all the way up to talented players. How it functions permeates through the discussion of Xrd seemingly forever. Take a lot of buttons, pop Roman Cancel at the right time, and you'll spend 25% of your bar. You can also YRC Roar in neutral with no button behind it, and from character to character that might be a really good idea, or most likely a really bad one. You also retain the momentum from your previous action, stop the game very briefly, and also slow down the opponent by half for about 18 frames, including attack startup and recovery. It's pretty big. Now, as to whether or not I think it's a good mechanic, well, I know I'm biased here because all the characters that I like get a lot of mileage from it. But I don't really think it's as big a deal as some people used to complain about. Yes, it is infuriating that it eats inputs, but at this point, it's just a part of the bullshit that makes Xrd the game that it is. And if this 25 bar maneuver is enough to turn you off of the game, fair enough. But I think fighting games always have a factor of what bullshit you're willing to accept and what crosses the line on a person-to-person basis. It's not nearly as bad as, you know, been years since I made Xrd videos and I still hate this character. But despite the mechanic being so polarizing, which implies that it's pretty one-dimensional, there is some nuance to using it that you should be aware of. So let's talk about it. If you're brand new to Xrd, getting familiar with the mechanics, or just not finding your footing, the first tip that I would give you is learn a combo that puts your opponent in knockdown over one that does big damage. It's hugely important to retaining momentum in gear. On a wider scale, the combo just needs to make it so that you're repeating the next interaction advantage, but learning how to get them into a knockdown is the best place to start in that regard. And the second would be, spend your bar. Far too often when I'm in a lobby with newer players do I see bars maxed out and stay maxed out. This also goes for plus R and like any Guilty Gear, but unlike plus R where you have EX moves that are almost always a good way to spend your meter when you're not sure what to do with it, here you have to spend on buttons that don't give you as clear an advantage. YRC is a great way to use that meter that can often feel unclear in how it should be used. Now it's always important to keep some meter. You never really want to spend till zero because faultless defense is so important for getting someone off of you. But if you've got some bar up to the red and there's a break in the action, at a low level, I would normally recommend finding a move that you can YRC to be the first person to command the pace. If you're a projectile character, I have really good news for you. You already have an incredible option to YRC to. Throwing out a projectile and spending your bar on it doesn't give you a neutral skip, but it does give you a lot of initiative. If you want to trail behind it and go for an approach, you now can. And thanks to the slowdown, your opponent doesn't have a lot of room to move out with it. Alternatively, you can set the projectile, and if you're a character like Dizzy, keep setting up behind it for even more projectile confusion. Or if you're Kai, creating more passive space, setting up a gate and then seeing what your opponent does to avoid the initial projectile. If you're a character with even a passable projectile, you should always keep this in mind. It can be hard to control the pace of a match at times, especially if you don't have great panic buttons, but YRC projectile is almost never a wrong option. But you play Johnny or Pot or some fucking weirdo guy, what should you do? If you've not got a decent commanding projectile, YRC is a little bit less clear in its quality. Keep in mind, the slowdown gives you a brief flash where you can see the game a little bit more clearly than usual, which is always a good thing, but otherwise it's a bit of a case-by-case basis. For example, Zweihander YRC is extremely good on Johnny. In the air it's incredible, and on the ground it's great for Johnny to just suddenly be in your opponent's face. However, whether or not you should be using it depends on distance, since you might end up going straight over them, or whether or not you want to be there right there and then. It's a good option, but if your opponent isn't trying to set anything up, they can just 6p you out of it, and now you've been identified as the silly guy. That's not to mention if your character even should be using YRC like that. Bedman's Task B YRC is giving Ken Air EX Tatsu its mother, but sometimes you don't want mother around. While moving that fast is cool, it's not often good for the character. For Bedman, that might be a decent option to get out of pressure, but it's rarely a good option for you to get into pressure with, because you're playing Bedman. You need to set up the chessboard so that you can pin their queen, in this case waifu. All of this though exists with some assumptions in mind. You're new, or you're not spending your bar even though you consistently have bar to spend. But what about this situation? This is where I reveal that this video is actually advice for me. Stop doing YRC. I have a tendency to overspend. Tempted by the prospect of a meal deal, I forget that I need the bar to make dinner, because I can't be mother without meter. But why? If you're playing Venom and doing a YRC is basically guaranteed to let you take your turn, surely you take the turn to retain or establish advantage, regardless of how much bar you have. That sounds good, but consider the circumstance that surrounds the scenario. If you're on red bar and your opponent has no meter or burst, damage is on sale, baby. Spend! However, in order to get to this position, chances are you should save meter early. Not because you might need the current 25 bar later, but because of how YRC affects the hidden mechanic, tension balance. Now, this shit's complicated, and you don't need to understand all the nuance unless you want to contribute to the wiki, but we're going to keep it simple. Think of Guilty Gear like having a running Tony Hawk multiplier in the background. When you start the round, it's on 1, and every subsequent positive action, you're gaining on that multiplier, and every defensive one, you're losing on the multiplier. Important to note is that this isn't the same as negative penalty, that's removing existing bar. This is about your potential meter gain. If we do this beginner B&B on Venom, at base tension balance, you gain around 20 tension. That's pretty good, especially since just playing neutral will probably gain you the 5 extra tension to reach the next meter threshold. If, however, you YRC before it, this is the balancing mechanic of YRC. If you press this button, you effectively bail. You can have maximum tension balance, but if you press this button, you cut off your entire multiplier. This is fine if you already have meter banked. Chances are you're not going to spend 75 bar in one interaction unless you've really fucked up. But by doing YRC early to win one interaction, you can fuck yourself over later in the game. If you ever feel like you just never have bar to spend, chances are it's because you spent so early that you're cutting yourself off from having bar to gain in future interactions. If you're confident enough to raw dog neutral, offense, and defense without the game's central mechanic, then go ahead. But remember, this part of the video is for me. Instead of spending on a YRC at 40 meter and trapping yourself into only ever having the little green man, oh look, there he is. It's often better to just hold whatever is coming next so that you can get 50 bar, and instead of having to rely on the panic of a YRC or the gamble of a blitz, keep the flexibility of supers, dead angles, and YRC and blitz. This particularly applies to Venom, but this point of knowledge also applies to other characters. You're a character that's twice as deadly with the option of a super to take away your opponent's bar, or a dead angle that lets you keep burst. 90% of the time, it's better to wait and see if you should spend with the risk of losing some life in the process, rather than gambling early and guaranteeing you don't have the resources to mitigate life loss when it's most important. And the advice for the people above my skill level? I don't know, I'm a fucking green square, what the fuck would I know? As always, fighting games are complicated, Guilty Gear is complicated, and these pointers aren't hard and fast rules, just things to consider that should hopefully make whatever choice you go for with your bar slightly more informed. Now go. Take this advice, be that whether you need to spend your bar or that you need to stop spending so fucking early, and play Xrd.